it's much harder to think that way, like it's much harder to create change when you understand that it's all connected, because you can pull one lever and 10 others go the wrong way. And,
Mm.
you might have achieved some sort of outcome, but within the broader context that may not necessarily on balance end where you want it to. I do think that's kind of an eternal struggle of holistic thinking.
Welcome back to another episode of the Force of Nature podcast. Today's special guest is Helen Beattie from the Veterinarians for Animal Welfare Aotearoa. I saw Helen speak a few weeks ago at the Ag Symposium in Dunedin, and I was thoroughly impressed with what she brought to the table. So I just had to get her on the podcast to talk about this more. Helen is a veterinarian with a hell of a lot of experience, and she's also done a lot in the advocacy space around animal welfare. Today's episode, we cover off what animal welfare really looks like and what you can be observing for as a farmer, what One Health system is, and how planetary health and human health is all interconnected with our animal welfare. We also talk about our food system and its interconnectedness with our health system and how we can actually thrive as a community. So without further ado, let's get into it. Helen, how are you today?
I'm great, thank you.
Can you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your background?
Sure. So I'm a veterinarian, got a few decades behind me now. And I guess the short story is I'm doing things that I never saw myself doing coming out of vet school. I imagine myself being a mixed animal practitioner. I grew up in the high country in central Otago, merinos and a few crazy beef cows and hunterways. So that was kind of where I saw my veterinary career going. Many twists and turns along the way, and went overseas and did some foot-of-mouth incursion, came back, bought a practice, worked in companion animal practice, trained veterinary nurses, worked at the SPCA as an animal welfare inspector and the chief inspector there in the shelter veterinarian. And then I was the lead vet at the New Zealand Veterinary Association for a period of time. And sort of from my SPCA time onwards, my interest in the law and policy and things that most young veterinary graduates think are boring as batshit sort of started to escalate. And now I find myself immersed in the world of law and politics and advocacy, and set up VAWA, so Veterinarians for Animal Welfare Aotearoa, after I left the NZVA, and sort of to pursue the advocacy line of work in order to try and, I guess, change things from the top down, or create some influence to try and get better outcomes for not just animals, but for all. Yeah, and in the meantime, I've got a couple of kids, and ride a road bike and drink too much coffee. And I'm also a second-year law student. So, yeah.
Jeez. So obviously an internal learner then, always trying to better yourself.
Yes, although I have to say, the things that you never see coming, I came out of veterinary school and I was like, never again will I do that to myself.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know what happened in the meantime, but some sort of brain failure, and definitely having not remembered quite how traumatic going back to university was going to be, and that the exams are just as bad when you're 50 as what they were when you were 18. So, yeah. So an eternal learner with some lack of foresight about the trauma that was going to cause.
Yeah. And you've picked two extremely hard topics as well, veterinary and law school. Not the easiest topics to be studying at uni. So you've kind of made it hard on yourself.
Yeah, it's funny. I think they're very, one's a science degree and one's an arts degree, obviously. And again, because of kind of where my career has gone with, leaning into this policy and advocacy stuff, it became a next sort of obvious step, really, either to do my animal welfare memberships and become a specialist in animal welfare. Most people don't even know that vets can do that, or do something that, might kind of open up another avenue, I suppose, in a way to create influence and change. It has been a real challenge for me going from being a very quantitative, fact data, here's the story, I can tell you how renal failure works, there's a list of things, to going into the critical thinking and ethereal world of law essays. It's been a long time since I've written that sort of essay, so there have been some challenges in re-engaging one's brain in the arts side. But yeah, it's great. I can certainly see how it's going to be useful. So hopefully that bears out to be true.
I'm sure it will be. So can you tell the listeners a bit more about why you set up Veterinarians for Animal Welfare Aotearoa?
So VAWA is it's a charitable limited company, which is a little bit of an unusual structure, but the limited company bit is it's just the vehicle to have set up the organisation. Because we're a charity, our constitution has a line in it saying, even though you're a limited company, you'll never give any money to shareholders. So it all
Mm.
goes back to charitable purposes. We all know how easy it is to set up a LIMCO here in New Zealand. So that's why I did it that way.
Yeah,
Much simpler than setting up a trust or incorporated society where you need lawyers and, and they're expensive, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Not yet, because I'm a student.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the intention long term for where I'm going as well. No, so yeah, set that up after I left the NZVA, and I guess I kind of had my rubber arm twisted, to be honest. Like I left there and had been doing, I guess, national level politicking and advocacy, and I'd been having conversations about things like winter grazing and live exports and dental procedures and cats and dogs and pigs and crates, all sorts of things. And yeah, there was a group of vets, I guess, that kind of lobbied me a bit, saying, look, we'd be keen to see you keep going and doing that stuff. And one thing kind of led to another. I've run business before, so I ran a veterinary clinic for a period of time with my partner at the time. And I frankly hated running business. It's not my thing at all. Some people love that stuff. I really don't. So the idea of setting something up and having another go wasn't really high on my, to-do list. But I also kind of thought, well, there's an opportunity here. I've been working in and around policy advocacy at that national level. And so it sort of seemed logical in a lot of ways to, if there was a time to give it a crack to see whether or not we could have a different, very animal welfare focused, veterinary led organisation trying to influence change, then now is probably it, having come from that job and, having connections and all sorts of useful things in the media and yada yada. So set up VAWA. So yeah, it's veterinary led, but we do have non-veterinary members. So like veterinary nurses, members of the public, animal welfare scientists. There's a collection of different people who I guess like the type of work that we do and the voice that we have. And the short story about who we are is it's about a good life for all. And that sort of comes back to this holistic thinking that I'm sure we're going to touch on. But a good life in the animal welfare world is about a life that's way better than a legal minimum. So it's really pushing into that positive welfare and good outcomes. But my view is, the world is connected and we can't have that for animals at the expense of everything else. It has to be, ideally everything working in harmony. So a good life for all means for people and the environment at the same time as we take care of our animals. That's the ethos that we run by.
That's awesome. And it sounds like you've got quite a good amount of support from within the industry as well for what you're doing. So people are obviously having these conversations and just want someone to lead on that front.
That's an interesting thing to postulate. I mean, I think there are people who definitely strongly support, I guess, kind of how we want to do business and how we talk about animal welfare and that holistic view of a good life for all. I'm absolutely certain there are people who wish I would sit down and not say anything at all as well. So, it's a bell curve. But I think, I guess I see myself. I mean, I'm a scientist at the end of the day. We're evidence driven. It's all about science, and I'm now bringing in a bit of artsy, law and essay writing as well. But no, at the end of the day, what we do and what we say is based in fact and evidence. Precautionary principle becomes important where we have gaps in that knowledge, but often around some of that stuff, like for example, lying time for cattle on winter grazing, it's not rocket science. You don't actually, we've got quite a bit of research, but without that, you don't need to look at, you can't defend necessarily those very bad situations that we see by saying we don't have enough science. Like common sense tells us that actually we know that that's not okay for the cattle or the environment. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to that. So yeah, precautionary principle I think is a really important thing too. I feel like sometimes the absence of evidence is used as a defence to do nothing, and that really frustrates me because we do need science, but we also just need to make sensible decisions from time to time.
Yeah, and I think there is science around that lying time as well, because I know that I'm part of a low-end trial for Dairy NZ on one of the research farms, and one of the metrics they're doing for the winter grazing is lying time, and they're actually tracking it between the two, like the three different wintering programs. So, and I've definitely read like there's a minimum amount of hours every day that a cow needs to be lying. So it's the same thing in everything. When you start bringing a holistic lens to any part of a farm model, the first thing that gets thrown out is there's no evidence to support that. And it's actually frustrating because there is evidence for a lot of the things out there. It's just not New Zealand focused.
Yeah, and that would be the key about the lying time thing. So there was research done recently around like bale grazing and
Mm,
differences between, crop lying and others, from a New Zealand specific context. And I guess, I mean, it's good to get it done, don't get me wrong, because then, for all the naysayers, then we actually have the New Zealand based research. But the fact is, cows like to lie, and it doesn't matter whether they're lying in America or they're lying in New Zealand, they like to lie. So, we have enough to know, and we know what they like to lie on too, not just that they like to, and,
mm.
10, 12, or sometimes 16 hours a day, but also that they don't like to do that when it's wet and sloppy. Yeah. I think the other thing that I get frustrated with, and again, not my wheelhouse, not my expertise at all, but there's all sorts of other ways to think about science, right? Like mātauranga, and that as a valid form of science that I feel like the Western world has been pretty dismissive of, when actually going back to how Māori, and I imagine a number of Indigenous peoples think about the world, is absolutely steeped in, an outcome and how you get there, but it just doesn't look like what we think of as science. We're
Yeah,
quite disrespectful about that, and I think we could learn a lot by taking a step back and listening pretty hard to those holistic views and taking care of the outcomes.
yeah, I totally agree. And I've definitely been having this year more conversations around, I guess, the indigenous knowledge of our landscapes, and like, how do we capture more of that so we understand? Because a lot of these indigenous cultures have been here for hundreds of years. So surely they must have noticed some patterns and things to learn from. And like as
Mhm.
farmers, we should actually be taking every little bit that we can to help make us
Mhm.
better from a holistic point of view. So it frustrates me when things get dismissive of past knowledge. Like a lot of what we've built today is based on that anyway. So
Yeah, 100%. I always remember this wonderful wahine, Naomi Aparo, at a meeting, standing up and just delivering this beautiful kōrero. And the essence of it was, rather than thinking about things from a reductivist,
mm,
choose a metric to measure in the Western world. So they were talking about trying to set up a regen system and going, which one of these 8 metrics do you think is most important? This is my very rough summary of what was going
yeah,
on. Can I just
yeah,
say, this is probably not what the meeting minutes said. And then she got up and she said, this is just not how Māori think about things, and I paraphrase, and I hope I don't step on anyone's toes, but she said, we wouldn't look at, can we improve the quality of the water from, you know, -10 to -8. We would look at it and go, how do we restore the modi of the awa, which is much bigger than that, right? Like, I kind of like to think about that concept as being the welfare, it's the welfare of the water, right? Like, it's not just one metric within it, it's the whole holistic system, and how it engages with the local environment, and from where it comes to where it goes, type thing. It really stuck with me because I think that was such a clear way of sort of delineating between the Western sort of reductivist approach to going this one metric, which, we do also need to understand, or will concede, but actually you could have that one metric being, quite perfect, but 10 others being poor, and you're not necessarily further ahead, or you have one improving at the expense of the others, and that's also problematic. And that's why that whole holistic, connected thinking needs to become part of what we do. It's much harder to think that way, like, it's much harder to create change when you understand that it's all connected, because you can pull one lever and 10 others go the wrong way. And
mm,
you might have achieved some sort of outcome, but within the broader context, that may not necessarily on balance end where you want it to. I do think that's kind of an eternal struggle of holistic thinking.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if we bring it back to a basic level, what does true animal welfare actually look like from your perspective?
Hmm. Yeah, so probably quite a different thing than what most people think of when they
Yeah.
think about animal welfare. So when I talk about animal welfare, or when people who have my understanding of it, and I'm only a little baby animal welfare person, let's be very clear. There are very big brains in this space, and mine is not one of them. But essentially, there's two ways to think, or the ways we use the term animal welfare. So the first is what most people think about, which is kind of that internal state of the animal. So do they have good welfare or bad welfare? They can have neutral welfare too. So that's the intrinsic, the animal's response to their lived environment, which is affected by all of the things around them. So the current, and there's no rules about this, but one of the frameworks that we use to think about that intrinsic animal welfare is something called the 5 domains. And New Zealanders are particularly attached to it because it was developed by a New Zealander. In fact, one of my lecturers from veterinary school, David Mellor, and his mate Cam Reed. So back in 1993, they first proposed this model. And so the 5 domains have 5 key parts: health, environment, nutrition, behavior, and then mental state. And collectively, those things determine the overall impact on the animal. So, for example, health is an easy one for people to think about. You either have good health or bad health. You could be sick with something or not. And that's overall going to affect your welfare state if you're not feeling well, if you've got nausea, if you've got a sore muscle, for example. So, they can be positive or negative or neutral in their impacts on your welfare. So that's the internal state. And then in order to understand those internal states, we use animal welfare science. So the actual science of understanding the animals and doing experiments and trying to figure out what they prefer, for example. So we've sort of moved a bit past a lot of the real coarse or basic stuff, I guess, from back when the animal welfare discipline first was evolved, and we were trying to figure out, do they feel pain? Those foundations are firmly set, whereas now a lot of animal welfare science is about trying to understand the different responses that animals have and their preferences around things, and doing studies to understand that, which helps us understand that internal intrinsic state. Mostly when people talk about animal welfare, they're thinking about an animal's health and possibly their nutrition.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting paper written on that by Kat Littlewood, which is worth having a read. I can send you a link. But that's only 2 of the 5 domains, right? It becomes about the other things as well: the environment, the behavioural interactions that animals have with each other and with people, other animals, etc. And then that overall mental state, like how do they feel about what's going on in their world? That's kind of the key difference, breaking it down to going, most people think health, nutrition, whereas holistically we think about all of those other things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, when people think animal welfare, they just would jump to how's the health of the animal, but there's just so much more to it. And when you do see really happy animals, there is some science around that. They actually do better, like performance, when they are happy and given, well, you are ticking all those boxes, but people would just think it's just so far-fetched or intangible to be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, there's been a time where people thought animals were machines and they weren't sentient, so we've come a long way, but there is certainly, we were taught going through veterinary school that you should not be anthropomorphic and, consider that animals have the same emotions that we do. And I get quite, you can argue that both ways, right? Like, of course, my responses and emotions aren't the same as yours. So that, that's a given. And so we also can't assume that then therefore a cow feels the same way as I do, which is a truism. But it's also true to say that we know that they have feelings about things, and maybe they do feel frustrated or bored or, I don't know, envious of another cow's very good grass patch or whatever, so those are all human emotions, but they don't necessarily feel them in exactly the same way for the same reasons that I do. We have different desire for different resources and different experiences. But it's the idea of happy cows, or I like contented. So happy is kind of a transient, you can be, I'm particularly happy talking to you at the moment and that leads to my overall contentedness, that there's less cost to their system if they're existing in that space, right? So it makes sense that they would do better. Now, quantifying that, coming back to the need for quantitative science, quantifying that is quite difficult. So there's so many things that feed into it. So it is kind of difficult, I guess, to stack up to say this particular thing made the cow this much happier and therefore that much more productive. You can see that that's enormously problematic, but the principle holds.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at it in the context of, say, winter grazing, it becomes quite a complex issue. How do you view us starting a conversation around animal welfare in regards to the current winter grazing practices, because it's a huge hot topic in New Zealand for many a reason, but I don't think the animal welfare gets a lot of like a light, and a lot of it is like I think about it as like how would I feel if I had to eat 60 days of the same thing over and over again and I was cold and didn't have enough shelter? Like, I wouldn't be too happy. So why do we think it's economic and good for the animal to do the same thing?
Mm. Yeah, so it certainly is complex. Like, I like to use provocative language, and many years ago it was like, oh, look, it's the perfect wicked problem, which irritated a bunch of people. And that,
Yeah.
wicked problems are not my idea.
No.
They came to play from a design theorist or something in Germany. But when you look at what a wicked problem is, winter grazing absolutely fits that criteria of, just being big and messy and interconnected. There's a great diagram on Google, thank you, Google, where it says a simple problem and it sort of crosses two lines like this, and then a complex problem or a wicked problem. And it's like a toddler who's got a pen and drawn on the paper. So really just messed up and interconnected and entangled and difficult to untangle. So yeah, I mean, I guess in my world, there's actually quite a lot of talk about the animal welfare side of winter grazing. So back in 2018, there was a fairly concerted campaign that was set up by a number of people that, people will be aware of kind of what happened there. And
Mm.
I was working at the Veterinary Association at the time, and, it was like, well, we can't walk past this, right? Like, this has to be something that we try to tackle. And so made that call for a pan-sector group to sit together. Because again, when you understand wicked problems, you understand that there is no one person who can fix it. It
Yeah.
requires a supply chain response to get everybody on the same page and hear different views and understand why the needle is really hard to shift. And for in Southland, for example, there's real challenges there around having 500 kilo cows on soils down there in the winter. So farmers will go, well, if I don't, then I'm going to trash the rest of my farm, trying to, keep them on grass over the winter. If you want to talk about the complexities of the supply chain, ultimately the bank lent them into those systems with mortgages that can really only be paid off with dairy payout, right?
Mm.
So do we blame the banks? Well, they were responding to national strategy, doubling exports back in the day. It's
Yeah.
just so complex along the supply chain. So that was one thing when the winter grazing task force got set up and made recommendations, and then there was an action group that went in and mapped those supply chains. And I sat on both of those groups, and it really consolidated my thinking around just, you need to raise the issue, and maybe an activist campaign is kind of helpful in, bringing it to the surface, because sometimes that is what's required. That's what caused a lot of change for bobby calves when there was the big expose back in 2015 or whatever it was, 16. But actually, an activist campaign that just points the finger at one party can't fix the problem. It's not a fixable problem. It's a predicament that we need to respond to, and then figure out what works, and then have another go and figure out what else works or what doesn't work, and just keep going back and rehashing it. And again, that's about wicked problems, right? No solution, responses to a predicament, and trying to move the needle. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the animal welfare in these systems. As we talked about before, like, there's a lot of evidence about what cows like to lie on, how many hours they like to lie. The Animal Welfare Act requires that they have access to adequate shelter, which is often not the case. We get then conflicts between back fencing to stop them trudging up and down the paddock versus the shelter is often at the back of the paddocks, and so there's a tension there about what we're trying to achieve. The cows are getting these days better, but it was quite variable access to good nutrition, because we know fodder beet, for example, is not a good whole diet. Access to water could be really sketchy. Even if it's in the paddock, then trudging through the mud can be really difficult to get there, so it's not really readily accessible. They'll drink surface water instead, which is pretty filthy. So from an animal perspective, you can go, well, there's not a lot of great stuff going on there. They're getting fed and they do put on weight. There are some bigger issues around that too. Then you look at the environment and you're like, well, it's not really looking that great either often. And we're talking about the bad cases here, right? I just want to acknowledge not all look like that. But, runoff and sediment into waters and soil structure getting destroyed and having to replant it every year, the environment's getting a hard time as well. And then from a people perspective, even though farmers will defend it, I think, which is, I understand why, because they're sort of in a very tight spot around where do they go now, what do they do, and industry, New Zealand, export, everything supported them into this system. I think there would be quite a few who would prefer to see their animals living in a different way, if they were perfectly honest. I don't know, but I just think, if you love your animals, then a bit like what you just said, it would be better if they didn't live like that. So there's the perfect one health, one welfare, holistic thinking. Everyone's having a bad time. It's all connected. You can't pull one lever without changing the others. And you're in this wicked predicament of, of it being so hard that actually very little gets done. And that, to my mind, is kind of where we've got stuck. There's a very long answer because it's a very complex problem. So
I think you've summed it up pretty well. It is such a complex issue. And there's just, if you try and work on one thing, then you've got the unintended consequences of something else. And yeah, it's going to be something that I think will stick around, but we'll probably hear a bit more noise, I think, coming from our consumers around animal welfare. So
yeah, I think so. And I think the other thing to bear in mind here, and this is again something that frustrates me, is that simply doing away with winter grazing in Southland and running a line through it overnight is going to have a national impact, right?
yeah.
And I get so frustrated when I hear people going, oh, we just get rid of it. I'm like, you don't even understand what you're saying, right? Like that is a significant part of our GDP that is predicated at the moment on those systems. Now, I'm not saying I think that's what it's going to be long term, but calling for an abolition is a significant recession that we would be looking at in order to, to run that line. And that people just haven't thought through kind of the connectedness of their own welfare and their own well-being as part of that system. So if you want to talk about problems that are really big, then it doesn't get much bigger than that, right? We'd be actually talking about, national GDP. So, yep.
Yeah, 100%. And also animal welfare issues as well. As soon as you cross that out, it creates a whole nother issue on the other side. So I guess we've talked a little bit about how we've got that interconnection between animal welfare, human well-being, and planetary health. Can you unpack that a little bit more from that One Health perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I guess life would be much simpler if we could just think in silos, as we talked about before. But it's just actually not how the world works. And I think you don't have to be a rocket scientist to kind of understand that. So back in the day, actually going back a long time, again, Indigenous people thought holistically and understood, and again, I'm out of my lane, you need to talk to an expert, but the idea that, the papa tuanuku supports everything and that's, that her welfare needs to be protected. So there's that, acknowledgement ultimately that we're all here by the grace of the planet, right? So that was kind of, I guess, the first One Health model, if you like, that is that Indigenous wisdom. And then sometime in the 1960s, the One Health model was developed, which is the three circles that you might see, a Venn diagram, where there's this overlapping bit of people, animals, and the environment. And that acknowledgement that bit in the middle is that connected bit. And then later on, I think it's early 2000s, the veterinary community. So One Health had sort of come out of a medical thinking more than anything, medical planetary thinking. And then One Welfare kind of rose up out of the veterinary community going, well, actually, we really talk about welfare for the reasons we've already spoken about, where in our heads, health is a subsidiary of welfare. You can't have really good welfare if you've got bad health. You can have okay welfare, but you could have better welfare if you improved all of those components of overall welfare. So I lean towards liking a One Welfare concept better than a One Health one for that reason, because it sort of speaks to my, the way I think about welfare. But actually, I think both of those models are flawed because if we come back to what Indigenous people have known since time began, is that all of those three circles, humans, animals, and the environment, have to be constrained by the global ecosystem, right? So there's a limit right around the outside of that. It's not just the little connected piece in the middle of the diagram. Actually, that whole system exists within the environment as a whole. So I would prefer that we somehow shifted our thinking to going, well, there's that little three-way connected piece down there in corner for this particular little issue that we're dealing with. But ultimately, that whole system has to fit inside our one constraint, which is planetary boundaries. And so when you start thinking about that again, talking about winter grazing or, I don't know, confinement and the energy that's required to run and raise chickens in sheds, for example, you go, well, there's some significant challenges there, right? The animal welfare is not great. They're fast growing. They get sore hocks. Their hearts can't keep up with the speed of their growth. We've got a system that's reliant on antimicrobials to keep animals healthy. We've got masses of energy going into those sheds to keep the temperature and the humidity right. When that fails, the animals have a terrible death, which, that does happen on a reasonably regular basis. But we do get cheap protein out of it, right? So that's good for human health and welfare. So that's the connectedness, it's about being able to pull those problems apart, all those challenges apart and go, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? And how do they all sit together alongside each other rather than just producing cheap protein, which is the case for those intensive systems? What is the greater cost or the holistic cost, and how do we, dial back or dial up, whichever way you want to look at it, around getting a better balance around all three of those things.
So with regards to like intensive poultry systems and similar systems to that, do you think there's a lot that our consumers don't actually understand when it comes to the animal welfare within those systems? There's a lot that they're missing, maybe?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's, that's a pretty broad generalization that I think a lot of people fall into. So, we're all consumers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But sort of referring back to the earlier conversation that we had, most people don't think about welfare the way people like me or people who work in this field do. They think health and nutrition and maybe not too much else. I think additionally, we are told a lot of things that aren't necessarily true. So, by people who I understand why they do it, but it's a little bit disingenuous. So, for example, saying fast-growing broiler chickens have appropriate welfare or good quality of life. That's true for some of them, but for a vast number, that's not true. They, as we talked about before, like they grow really quickly, their hearts can't keep up, they can barely move, they are very restricted in being able to move around the shed, even if they could move. And then there's, as I say, antimicrobials needed to stack up those systems. So a lot of people don't necessarily understand all of that, and then industry narratives will sort of gloss over it. I would be at pains to point out that actually those systems produce cheap protein. So there becomes this conflict right around going, well, how much do we want to know? How much do we not want to know? And then how do we, if we're going to actually do the right thing, then how do we make quality food affordable for everybody who needs it as well? So this is why it's a wicked predicament again, right? Because there's no one single lever. We can run extensive free-range systems. It's going to cost more, and there's going to be an impact on consumers because of that. So I think there's probably a little bit of turning a blind eye by some people who maybe do know that it's not great. Like there's free-range choices at the supermarket for eggs. Not everybody buys them, and in fact, we know that that there are absolutely choices made, even though if people really believe in wanting high welfare products, when it's 2 or 3 times more expensive, they will choose not to buy it. So there's a big thing to work through there about how our food system works, which is another one of my passion projects, but about having a proper food system, a national food strategy for New Zealand, but actually arguably for the globe. But let's focus on New Zealand to make sure people can access healthy, nutritious and affordable kai. That's a really big challenge. I don't need to tell you how much butter is at the supermarket at the moment, I'm sure, which is just it's infuriating. It's wrong that's what's going on.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I find it blows my mind that when we talk about health or our food systems, we keep them separate conversations when they're actually completely interconnected.
Yeah. And that's a great example of where we've gone into this ridiculous siloed thinking, right? There's research published on, if we get the food system right, how much it saves us in our health system, and not just about diabetes, but all this other stuff and microbiome, and it's so broad, kind of emerging science too, right, around some of the more holistic impacts of that stuff. But you can take the counter narrative, which is how are ultra processed foods, how are they doing for us? Not very good.
No.
There's just they're just heinous, and yet, they're cheap, accessible, and then there's the massive cost. So if you take all of those costs out of the system and transfer it over here to start developing a healthy food strategy, what would the balance then look like? I mean, way beyond my pay grade, but those are the things we need to start thinking about. Farmers, of course, still need to be able to make a living, but I would argue in this country that it's pretty outrageous that we can't afford to buy our primary produce, which is beautiful, and it should be accessible to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got some of the most nutrient rich in the world, so we could probably solve a lot of our health issues, or growing health issues in this country by actually making it more accessible for everyone. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and yeah, just the whole thing around ultra processed foods being so accessible and cheap. Of course, people are going to buy those over, the free range eggs or the holistically raised animals because of that price difference.
Yeah, and we know they're designed to be addictive, and there's a super interesting little doco that's going on Netflix or something at the moment about, the melt point. Even though it's a twisty, it's actually a melting food because there's no substance to it once you crush it, and that's addictive, and it means that we don't feel full when we eat them. It's a clever industry. We need to use those tools to re-engineer ourselves backwards to where we need to be, because it's marketing that's got us there, right? Like social science and convincing us that this is the way forward, that we'll all feel happier and better and richer and, better. We know that's a lie. So now we need to start using those tools to market people back in the other direction, in my view.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. So if I'm a farmer or even as a consultant in my work, how do I go about observing welfare beyond just the physical health, which I'm more familiar with? Is there, say, emotional or behavioural indicators that I could pay attention to?
Great question. And the answer is yes, there's lots of different things. So again, taking, cows as an example, I do like to talk about cows. So when we think about welfare, as well as thinking about it from those 5 domains perspectives, we talk about something called a good life, which is VAWA's tagline, right? As I said, a good life for all, which means providing animals, ideally people on the planet, with a life that is well above a legal minimum. So on a good life scale, you have down at one end the kind of where regulation sits. So that's minimizing the worst of suffering. So we say you can't castrate a 6-year-old bull or ram without pain relief, because that's hideous, as an example. So we have a cutoff down there, much younger. They still feel pain, to be fair. There's a bit of a pragmatic, there are some challenges around rolling out, what's absolutely best for welfare, I would acknowledge. So that's at one end of the welfare spectrum, and that's what we would call a life not worth living, because actually all you're doing is minimizing suffering. So that in those systems, you can still be confined, for example, pigs, chickens. Overseas, there's cattle that milked, and cross ties and stalls and so on. So a life not worth living is not really where you want to be. In the middle, there's a life worth living. And so that's kind of the neutral. There'll be a bit of negative and some positive stuff, obviously tracking in the right direction. And then at the other end of the scale is a good life. And that's the idea that not only are your needs met, but actually there's these opportunities for positive welfare. And as I say, well above the legal minimum, because you can have positive welfare that's just better than the law, but actually we want it to be a lot better than the law, because the law really is to catch the tail enders, right, essentially. So things that you might want to do for a dairy cow, for example, does she get to hang out with her mates, right? Cows are social. Their social nodes are important to them. Does she get to not be bullied too much? That's a little bit of normal behaviour too, right? Cows sorting out cows. But fundamentally, are they able to form social groups that are important to them? And you could say running with their calf, slightly contentious, having somewhere to lie. And it's not just about being able to lie, it's about being contented to lie. So being able to sink deeply into their lying position and sleep comfortably. We know when they're on sloppy surface, they perch up because they don't really want us to lie into it. You could give them a multi-sward pasture. I was up visiting a farm on Friday and went in, and there was chicory, which was good enough to eat. So a little munch on that. I'm like, man, this just looks so much more interesting than just ryegrass, right? And it's good for all sorts of reasons, as you'll be aware. And you could provide a scratching brush. There's great videos on YouTube about how much cows like to use scratching brushes, or have things to play with in the paddock if you feel so inclined. Now, a little bit of that people will go, that's pretty woke, Helen, but and maybe a scratching brush and a wall, maybe that is pushing the limits. But actually, all those other things that I've talked about, that is a way to provide cattle with something that's more than just health and nutrition. It's about their social behaviours, it's about their environment, it's about their enjoyment in eating, not just having enough to eat, but actually being able to go in there and chew on those multi-swords. Now, you're not going to know how happy she is. And that's the challenge, right? But you can look at the science and say, well, we know these things contribute to good welfare. These are positive experiences for cows. So if I'm providing these opportunities and she is then choosing to engage with them, then we're pushing into that positive welfare, giving animals a good life. I also just want to be clear, the other thing that we need to be really mindful of is welfare is not all just about good stuff, right? You need bad welfare to survive. So there's if we think about, I like to talk about welfare worms, these wiggly up and down, how your welfare experience goes over a day, a week, a month, whatever. And, really positive welfare experiences might be the brush or playing with your friends or whatever. And then a negative welfare experience is, I'm hungry, I'm going to go and eat. And so those survival critical negative pieces are survival critical. We have to have them. But what we're looking for a good life is, on balance, most of the welfare experiences are on top of the neutral line, and we limit what we can below the line, pain relief and so on and so forth. So lots of things you can do. What you can't do is give it a number. And that's kind of, I guess, part of the frustration. But if you're doing all of those things, then we know that those are the things that cattle will choose to do, that we can see them having a positive experience from, because of the animal welfare science that's been done on it. Then you can confidently say, because the cows have the option to do those things and they're choosing to do those things, then rowing their back on a brush is a good experience for them to be having.
Yeah, totally. And it always makes for a good video when you see it on social media as well,
great,
to be honest. Yeah. And I think the farmers that do go out of their way to try to provide like a better environment for their cows will say that they can anecdotally tell there's different behaviour within their herd. But so, yeah, how do you measure that other than like you just know the feeling and you've seen the change in behaviour?
Yeah. And I think, if you're so inclined to read the research, there is a bunch that you can, dive into. But some of those basic things that I just described, like making sure lying surface is good, multi-swards and, shade, for example, that's another really big thing. So on, Canterbury dairy farms, I mean, those are super challenging, right? Like those animals are less productive in the heat and suffering because of heat stress. I mean, talking about wicked problems. Big trees don't go very well, centre pivots. There's another one that needs to be an industry conversation about. But yeah, but you can certainly be confident if you're providing those things that the welfare has gone up a level. Exactly how much, I don't know, but certainly you're improving it.
Yeah, totally. And I think that heat stress on the Canterbury Plains is going to be something that gets talked about more in the coming years. And farmers are actively trying to plant and create more shelter, but the centre pivot irrigation, when it went in, wasn't thought of at all. It was trying to get the maximum area of irrigation done for the easiest possible system.
And coming back to this holistic thinking, right? Like this is, to my mind, where we've policy or farmed ourselves or regulated ourselves into these corners that are now incredibly difficult to get out of. I kind of like thinking about it, or like and find it frustrating, but we got to where we are by 1,000 cuts, right? Like little changes or whatever. There's been a lot of steps to get to where we've got to over the last 40 years. And logic would hold that you could then just undo them one by one to get back to where we are. But it doesn't work like that, because the infrastructure and the money that's now invested in capital and assets, and it becomes a really big obstacle to get over, which is the winter grazing situation in Southland. What do you do on that land that can return enough profit to pay off those mortgages? Like that's I've been known to throw the word subsidise out, but people get quite alarmed by it. But there's only so many options at this point around moving to a properly sustainable system in some of these areas, and centre pivots is another one. Just coming back to welfare, the other thing I just want to add is, not only about, to get towards a good life. If you think about those welfare worms, and I can send you a picture of a welfare worm, it's also about minimizing the negative pieces. So you have to be hungry to want to eat, and that is why you survive, and that's same for drinking and so on. But for example, if farmers or if one of the team members have a practice of harrying the cattle up the lane, and that causes stress, then you can also, you can minimize the negative side of the curve as well by having better practices. And that overall, of course, then adds to or links to having, more positive welfare and a good life as well. So it's about increasing the stuff on the top and reducing the stuff on the bottom to shift the whole balance upwards.
Yeah, totally. So do you think there are some parallels between the way in which we treat our animals within our food systems and then how we're actually treating ourselves as a community?
I do, from the point of view that we've got very siloed thinking, and that this is all connected. And if we get our animal care right, then we're going to have a whole bunch of environmental things that are going better. So trees and biodiversity and means shade, and then arguably, there's going to be people that feel better about what they're doing as well. And I think that the same sort of principles apply within the human field, right? Like we get very siloed in our thinking without going, so these health issues, what are they really to do with? Well, a whole bunch of them is, food. so if we could get that piece right, then, what does that mean? Then that tracks back to what we talked at before around having a healthy food system where, nutritious, affordable kai for all. So, it's all just one big smush of connectedness, right? And like I say, it's so much easier to think in a silo. It's way easier for my little brain, but it's just not the way the world works.
Yeah, you can come up with an answer a lot easier for that when you're just working in your silo and ignoring everything else that is connected to that. Are you seeing like consumers becoming more interested in how interconnected everything is within a farm system?
Yeah, I am. And I think that the very fact we're having this conversation, right? Like, I don't think 10 years ago you'd be getting on, the managing director of VAWA to talk about animal welfare. I could be wrong. Maybe it's been going on for longer than that. But I do think there is increasing awareness of the animal welfare conversation. I feel like we're a long way behind the environmental conversation, like 20 years or something, around how we are really genuinely embedding it in policy and doing the right thing, and being responsible to our external markets. So the environment's been bedded into things like trade agreements and so on for a long time, whereas the FTAs with the UK and the EU, they both have animal welfare chapters, but they're not very, the EU one specifically is quite general, very difficult when you're talking to, is it 16 EU countries or whatever it is, like how do you write a standard to manage that? So it's quite general, and it's a sort of a like-mindedness piece. One with the UK is a bit more specific. So the fact that, and actually Liz Truss drove the need for that being in there. So that's I guess, pretty high level understanding of kind of what's driving process, and presumably that's a blowback from consumers, Sainsbury's and the likes who are pretty powerful. So I do think it's happening. I think it's far too slow for my liking, but actually patience is a good thing, because we actually can't do this too quickly either, because livelihoods depend on, are dependent on our current system. So we need to find a way to do a, transition carefully and safely. But I don't think it's going to go away. I think the challenge is going to become, if we had another whole podcast to talk about energy and the limits to the energy system, then when shit really starts to get funky around energy becoming way more expensive, when we're making renewable products from renewable energy, that is expensive. And then what do our farm systems look like, and how affordable is protein? And I think that at the point where people can't feed their families, then they will make very different choices than what their morals, would necessarily, that they may hold very true and very dear. But if it comes to feeding your family, then people will make hard choices. So that might be a 20, 50-year conversation, but I think that this is going to change over time, just focusing on what I can do now.
Yeah, definitely. I guess we gotta, one bite at a time of the elephant, and then we'll get
Yep.
there eventually. So with that in mind, if we were to reimagine the current food system and we're taking everything into account, a One Health approach, where should we start, or where do you envision we should actually start to get things moving in that direction?
Golly. It's much easier just to describe the outcome. The steps from
Okay.
there. So if we start with the outcome, I mean, my
Yeah.
view is that we need light, local, biodiverse systems.
Hmm.
Like we need to get back to nature, closer to nature, hands in the soil. We need, monocultures of things are generally not healthy. You get, massive schools of fish and whatever. There are natural kind of monocultures, if you like, but where we've engineered them, as a generalization, they're pretty unhealthy. Like too much of anything is not a good thing.
Yeah.
So by creating biodiverse systems, and I mean like different animals in our system, not just the nature biodiversity, then you can offset a lot of some of the challenges. So that's kind of the end goal, I think. So light-footed systems that produce local food, and again, coming back to my slight little energy rant there, but I think that personally, you either sort of do or don't believe this. I think at this point it's pretty binary, is my experience with people on energy. But if you believe that energy is going to become a constraint, then it means we need less energy going into our systems in every way, shape, or form. So urea, electricity, food, and we need to transport food less.
Mm.
The additional reason why that's good is because we then have local communities producing local food for their people. I think it's hard to argue that regionalised food is not a good idea. It would limit, we wouldn't be eating strawberries down here in Dunedin at the moment, but there would be some limits to what your diet might look like. But it gets back to a much more old-fashioned sort of way of seasonal food and that sort of thing. And of course we would still move stuff around. That's not a hard line. And I think moving the steps that we need now to get to that place where we can safely feed our people healthy food, they are all around de-intensification, if I was to summarize it, like less energy into the systems, lighter on the environment, better for the animals, safer for the people because they're more resilient. And, it's less likely those systems will tip over with one little thing going on. I will qualify that heavily by saying GDP is a very controlling thing. So there's a massive challenge there to think through, what does this look like if we are really going to start transitioning our systems to more sustainable long-term solutions? Then are we letting go of the neoliberal capitalist GDP paradigm? That's a huge conversation, and I'll just throw that one out there provocatively. I think we should, but
I think most people just don't understand it enough to even have a comment or an opinion on it. I think, and even the energy part of it in farming is so misunderstood. Could potentially happen. You just have to look at if there's a decent war and we get constrained again on what we can get here, how vulnerable New Zealand is as a little island way down the bottom, away from everyone else.
Yep, exactly that. And so the, light local biodiverse systems are way more resilient, right? Because you don't have to shift all that stuff around to keep them going, and you don't need antimicrobials, which is, they're all going to run out in the end too. That's why we worry about resistance. But these are big challenging conversations, and ultimately we at this point have not been able to make a choice to get away from perpetual growth. And I realize how big it is what I'm saying, but I also look at it and I go, everything that perpetually grows dies, right? It's the definition of cancer. And bacterial colonies that outgrow their agar plate, it's just, that is the natural course that happens with perpetual growth. So I'm not quite sure why we think we're any different, but again, that might be a conversation for a different day, Conan.
Yeah, that's a huge topic in itself. We can delve into there around human psychology, I think, as well. That's another whole podcast. So I generally finish up my podcast with 4 quick-fire questions for you. So the first one is, if you could change one thing about our agricultural industry, what would it be?
Leadership.
Leadership.
Yeah. So I'm being a little bit unhelpful there when I say that. I actually mean leadership overall. So
Hmm.
government direction, local government, industry, or like the whole thing, like to my mind, we need to have some pretty big conversations around what are we doing, where are we going,
Yeah.
and so I'm not just pointing the finger at any one person on that leadership. It's me too, because I'm annoying and provocative and that disengages people. So I'm to blame too.
No, I totally agree, and I always say that we don't really have a shared vision as a country. Like, what are we working towards?
Yep.
I think we really lack that. And if we had something like that to work toward, and we all bought into it, we could
Yep.
do some really cool stuff
How
here.
good could we be, right?
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah,
That's it.
exactly.
It's got to be bipartisan. Everyone's got to buy in. It needs to be developed through co-design and all those cool things everyone talks about. But that's genuinely setting up that vision, that ag vision or national vision. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking back at your younger self, what's one piece of advice you'd give?
Say less, listen more, and be patient. These things
That
are
applies to
achievable.
everyone. Yeah, I love that. And what's something that excites you at the moment?
Despite the answer to my first quickfire, which quickfire doesn't work with Helen, I actually feel quite excited at the moment about how much conversation around the need for change that there is. And I think it feels quite palpable that there is I wanted to say groundswell, but I will not. There is a tsunami of change, like I feel like there's momentum coming in behind these conversations that, like we've had today, and the work that you do, and the stuff that we, heard from some of those people at Ag at Otago, etc. So that excites me, because I think, great, now's the time, let's jump on it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It feels like there's some sort of energy behind it now, and the wider public are having some of these conversations or asking the questions, whereas maybe 2 or 3 years ago you wouldn't have half of these. So I agree with you on that, for sure.
It feels safer now to be a bit braver, right? And I think there's real tension there, right? Because it is kind of brave to come out and to speak up, and that's part of the problem. You shouldn't need to be brave. We should be able to have these conversations. And now, because so many people seem to be on board with that, it is way safer for people to actually come out and say what they think, and that can only increase the kind of the citizens movement, of direction of change. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. And finally, what's force of nature to you?
Well, I realise this is a loaded question.
Yeah, it is.
I'm not going to say Conan, but yeah. When I read that question first up, my mind went to the idea that you can't fight nature. Like Papa Tuanuku in herself is a force. She is the force of nature, and there is no point fighting that. We have to work alongside it, because otherwise forces of nature will tear us down, which is, arguably, she's delivering some receipts at the moment, right? And they're pretty uncomfortable. And I think if we could get on board with what is her force of nature, which is actually a really good force of nature, then we would have less of the other outcomes. And, talking about all these climate change and biodiversity, don't know all those things, but yeah, and that comes back to that holistic thinking, right? Like working and living inside planetary boundaries, and how do we get there without decimating the population and having starving people? And I mean, these are massive conversations, and I don't have an answer for all of those things. I just see that's what we need to do. And the more people that can speak and do speak and can kind of, become part of that movement, then we're one step closer to working alongside Papa Tuanuku.
I totally agree, and it's a very powerful way to finish this. So if someone wants to connect with you, Helen, where's best to go and find you?
Well, all my details are on the website, which is at www.vawa.co.nz. That's VAWA. If they want to hear more of my words after all of these words, then they should feel free to ring me.
Yeah.
But be aware that there's a lot of words.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I'll put a link in the description below. But thank you very much for your time today, Helen. We've covered a lot of topics, and I'm sure we could keep going for another couple hours.
I'm sure we could. It's been great. Some unexpected twists and turns, but it's been great.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, see you.
See ya.